Afternoons with Josh Szeps on ABC Radio.
Hope you're having a terrific afternoon. It looks like a beautiful day out there. It's getting chilly in the mornings, but I do love a Sydney autumn and a Sydney winter. Do you eat as much salmon as you used to? Or were you scared off by the bad PR that Tasmanian salmon got when environmentalists sounded the alarm about intensively farmed aquaculture in Tassie? The Tasmanian state government has released a 10-year plan to expand the salmon industry. This could impact what you eat. I'd love to know your thoughts, feelings, questions about it on 1300 222 702. You remember this big brouhaha, right? Last year there was a lot of hand-wringing about how intensively farmed salmon in Tasmania is. Fed with antibiotics, inadequate management of diseases. These were the allegations about these big salmon, about essentially the future of the salmon industry in Tasmania and thus in Australia. And at the time, this caused a lot of people to either reduce or suspend the amount of Tasmanian salmon that they eat. The Tasmanian government now says that, well, they basically blame what they call a vocal minority of environmental groups who oppose salmon farming. At the same time, a number of Hobart restaurants have stopped serving Tasmanian salmon in recent years. So there's a full-scale attempt by the government in Tasmania to rehabilitate the industry. In a moment, you'll hear from Peter George, who's from the Tasmanian Alliance for Marine Protection, and our ABC Rural Tasmanian reporter Fiona Breen, who's covering this story, just to give you some understanding of the way the stoush is unfolding down there and how it will impact what's on your plate. But take a listen first to a few minutes from our colleagues in ABC Mornings in Hobart. Leon Compton is the host, and Leon spoke with Tasmania's Minister for Primary Industries and Water, Joe Palmer, just this morning about this. We invited the Tasmanian Primary Industries Minister on this show. She directed us to this conversation. So let's kick things off by informing ourselves about her beliefs. Have a listen.
You announced yesterday that you want greater transparency from the Tasmanian salmon industry over the next 20 years. What does that mean?
Well, I think that's something that the community's being asking for. So, we've always done that through our salmon portal. So we're reviewing that. We're looking to expand the information that is available on the portal. That's going to include things like public reporting to actually align to implementing the new aquaculture standards as they're enacted. We just want to make sure that that information is there in a really timely manner, that it's easy for the public to understand. Some of the criticism we've had in the past about the salmon portal was that it was hard to understand. You had to go looking and searching for information. So making more information available and more accessible to people to find it when they need to.
So let's pick an issue, a specific. In February, the Mornings team, through the Tasmanian Inquirer, learnt that Tassal didn't want to release information about 600 kilos of antibiotic use adjacent to Conningham Beach early last year, at a time when a heap of Tasmanians are swimming and fishing right nearby. And there was more antibiotics that were used at Oakhampton Bay. In both cases, Tassal argued it wasn't in the public interest and it was commercial in confidence. The EPA then told the Mornings program that they had no power under current laws to compel Tassal to release that information. Under your proposed changes and more transparency, will Tasmanians who swim and fish at Conningham Beach have a right to know if antibiotics are being used in that water?
Well, that's part of what we're going to be doing with our review of transparency, is looking at what does really matter to the people of Tasmania. What do they have a right to know about? And what do we need to do to make sure that the EPA is in a situation where it can look at that? And that's all part of the review into transparency. We're really hoping that this salmon plan is going to be a reset, and that the Tasmanian community is going to feel that, industry working with government is striving really hard to ensure that they are able to access the information that they want when they need it.
But this is the 20-year plan. Will Tasmanians in future know if antibiotics are being used in their local waterways in real time?
Well, that, as I say, that's part of the review. That's part of the body of work that we're doing.
But sorry, Minister, this isn't under review anymore. This is the plan. What does the plan say about people's right to know about antibiotics use?
I think that we're going to work really, really hard to ensure that we can get that sort of information out in a really timely manner. That's what we're striving for, and that's why we have the EPA as an independent regulator. And my understanding is that the EPA needs to get that information from the companies. And so we have to work through that. We have to make sure that we do have that level of transparency that is expected.
That's the Tasmanian Minister for Primary Industries and Water, Joe Palmer, speaking on ABC Radio Hobart. This morning, the Tasmanian government releasing a big multi-decade plan for the salmon industry. I'd love to know from you what your feelings are about Tasmanian salmon at this point. 1300 222 702 is the phone number. Have you cut down on it? Have you given up on it? What would you need to see change in Australia's relationship to salmon farming to get back into eating salmon? I'd love to know. 1300 222 702 is the number. The text line is 0467 922 702. Fiona Breen is one of the executive producers for ABC Rural Tasmania who's been covering this story. G'day, Fiona.
G'day.
What do you make of the government's push?
Well, I think it's a bit of a push to, as they say, reset the industry. Joe Palmer, the Minister for Primary Industries, says this industry is desperate to improve its social licence and to sort of get on the front foot again. And, you know, this plan, which is actually doesn't have a time frame anymore, is part of the way it's going to do it. You know, apparently increasing transparency. But as you showed in that interview that Leon Compton had, you know, how do you make these companies release some of this information when they're all private companies now? They're not listed on the stock exchange. They're owned by big international groups. There's a lot of water under the bridge, so to speak, to get through this.
I'm relieved, Fiona, that you said that the time frame of the plan has been abolished, because I've seen reports that it's a 10-year plan. I've seen other reports that it's a 20-year plan. I just vaguely said it's a multi-decade plan.
It's just a plan.
Look, it's a plan now. It could be a millennia. We've got a 2,000-year plan. We've got a 5,000-year plan for salmon fisheries in Tasmania.
That's right.
Fiona
well,
Breen.
This is a plan without a lot of detail. I mean, I think that came across in Leon Compton's interview there. There's, you know, a whole lot of good ideas to increase transparency, to make this portal that you get all this information from online, to make that better, but we don't sort of know how that's going to be made better. We're going to look at how we treat interactions with wildlife, and that means interactions with seals, but we don't really know what they're going to do there. So a whole lot of different bits and pieces. There's going to possibly be some exclusion zones, but what is interesting, they're not ruling out bringing dormant sort of leases to life or really cutting the farming footprint of active or non-active leases. So that's not going to make many people happy.
Yeah, right.
Interesting as well, like you're asking your listeners who eats salmon, you're sort of suggesting that maybe a lot of people have decided not to eat salmon. I put to the Minister, Primary Industries Minister, Joe Palmer, you know, she talks about a vocal minority. I put to her, well, how do we know it's a minority? How do we know the numbers? And she mentioned that we know that because the salmon companies have asked people who like salmon, and so many people have responded to that. So I don't know what your listeners think about that sort of straw poll.
I mean, it was big. It was very big news here when Richard Flanagan was going on about it. And Jenny writes on the text line, one of our listeners, read Toxic by Richard Flanagan. I will never eat Tasmanian salmon again. The government and regulators are clearly corrupt and are responsible for this. And in a moment, we'll speak with Peter George from the Tasmanian Alliance for Marine Protection, who shares a similar point of view in opposition to the industry. But what's your sense, Fiona? I mean, here we heard that lightning bolt, and I think it did impact people's consumption of Tasmanian salmon. I eat it less than I used to, and I think I'm probably an ordinary Sydney sider in that regard. But when the industry in Tasmania says that this is a vocal minority of environmentalists who've sparked this conversation, what's your sense about the sort of man or woman in the streets attitude towards it?
Well, you do hear discussions like that. I mean, the minister says, you know, it's a vocal minority, that generally people accept this industry and support it, but you do hear discussions about just simply whether I'm going to cook salmon tonight or whether I'm going to look at another type of fish. And we have at least 3 or 4 restaurants that I've spoken to. Mona, which many of your listeners probably know about, the 2 restaurants out there, they haven't used salmon since about 2017, and that was their decision because they don't like the way it's farmed. The Agrarian Kitchen, Rodney Dunn, which is another high-profile restaurant, they haven't used it since about 2019. Their own decision as well, but they do say people often ring up and say, is salmon on the menu? I don't want to come if there's salmon on the menu. That's what they say. There are other restaurants here that have toxic stickers up in their hotel and they won't use salmon. But then, there's a whole lot and some really big ones that do use salmon. So it's hard to say.
I mean, it would also be interesting to know, Fiona, what are we displacing salmon with? Like, what are you eating instead of the salmon? And what is the story of that as well? Where is that fish that you're replacing it with or the other meat coming from? And, has anyone looked into that the way that Richard Flanagan has looked into Tasmanian salmon, or are we just reacting to our observability bias, I suppose, and reacting to the things that are in front of us? And salmon gets bad headlines, so we move over to something that may in fact be worse.
Right. Well, I think, there are certainly fish businesses that might be looking at other sustainable products, and we hear a lot more. We have a lot more scientific information about what is sustainable and what isn't. But maybe people are going to more plant-based products, and there can be problems with those as well, depending on how they're farmed and soy and all that sort of stuff. It's a vexed issue, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And Paul in Brookvale says on the text line, I may not fully understand this story, but how is it legal to put antibiotics into the biosphere? It is, right?
It is legal to put it into the fish or to put it into the fish pens. And, there is an issue that they need to do this for fish welfare. The RSPCA might be called in if they don't look after their fish. I know they use antibiotics in the small fish, which are often in a closed loop sort of system. But as we heard from Leon Compton there, through FOI documents, the ABC discovered that quite a bit of antibiotics have been used in pens not far from a nice swimming beach. There seemed to be no, the bodies, the state government body or the body targeted with looking at that didn't seem to have any power to make the company tell us exactly what was being released into the water. That's the Environmental Protection Office. I mean, these companies are private companies now, and I think there are some issues about how we can make them tell us or tell people exactly what they're doing. How do we get them to report? They don't answer.
Well, I mean, you just pass a law, don't you?
That's it. And there's been no extra laws passed.
No, but I mean, if the Tasmanian government wanted to, they could just say you're not allowed to put antibiotics into the, you're not allowed to use antibiotics in aquaculture unless you issue a statement saying that you've done so.
Yes, yeah. I do know antibiotics. They say the use is rare, but it is definitely still needed to keep the fish healthy at various times. They have amoebic gill disease that pops up and a few other bits and pieces.
Yeah, fascinating. Fiona, thanks for briefing us on it. Good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thanks. That's Fiona Breen from ABC Rural Tasmania, who's been covering the story about the fallout from the bad PR that Tasmanian salmon got. You may remember that from last year. Richard Flanagan wrote a book and a subsequent article which got a lot of people talking about the intensively farmed aquaculture in Tasmania, saying that that's terrible for the environment and for people's health. As a result, have you cut down your consumption of Tassie salmon? 1300 222 702 is the phone number. We're talking about it today because the Tasmanian government is going back on the charm offensive. They're basically saying they've got a new plan. It was originally a 10-year plan, then it's a 20-year plan. Now it's an infinity-year plan that's going to shake up the industry and it's going to make Tasmanian salmon globally competitive. It's going to overcome what the government calls a vocal minority of environmental groups who oppose salmon farming, is going to try to counter the push from a number of fancy Hobart restaurants who've stopped serving Tasmanian salmon in recent years and is going to rehabilitate the reputation of Tasmanian salmon. That could have an impact on what you eat, especially if you find yourself scratching your head going, hang on a minute, so is it good or bad? Is it worse or better than eating beef? 1300 222 702 is the phone number. Mike in Newport, g'day.
Good afternoon, Josh. Josh, I've been down to have a look at these farms in Tasmania about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Those fish pens are open. The cost of antibiotics would prohibit most of those companies from just tossing away kilos and kilos of antibiotics just to get washed away into the crystal clear waters down there. Now, we don't drink salt water because we all know what fish do in water, and there's other diseases as well. I've been eating packet smoked salmon there for somewhere between 15 and 20 years. My health hasn't suffered, and I buy a packet every week. We also eat salmon twice a week, and I don't know where it comes from. I don't really care, but it's good for you. It's got all the essential things that you need from eating seafood. So I honestly cannot see what these greenies or environmentalists are actually going on about.
Okay, well, I'll bring it to you in just a moment, Mike. Stay listening. We'll get to it before the news headlines at past. Good to hear your point of view. Thanks, Mike. Have a good one. Take care. Joe's given us a call. G'day, Joe.
G'day, how you going?
Terrific. What do you want to know?
Mate, two things. I eat all varieties of fish, salmon included, and fish are commonly farmed these days. So why pick on salmon is my question, because I don't know any better, but I'd like to understand why. But secondly, I also want to make a point that received through the mail a few years ago a sample of a clothes washing product that had caniston in it. It's an antibiotic. What's being done to stop that, and why is there no hoo-ha about such?
I don't know, but there might be differences between compounds that kill bacteria on clothes and things like that, and an antibiotic, which is for mammalian consumption. But I don't know about that, Joe. But let me park your other.
There might be.
Yeah, let me put your other question to. Let me put your other question to our expert, because Peter George joins us, who's the head of the Tasmanian Association for Marine Protection, as the Tasmanian government unveils its big hoopla plan to rehabilitate the Tasmanian salmon industry. Peter George, thanks for being here. Our listener Joe, you just heard him ask, why pick on salmon? Why pick on salmon?
Thanks for having me, Josh. Why pick on salmon? Because when you eat salmon, you're killing Tasmania, and you may well be damaging your own health. The truth of the matter is that the salmon are raised in these huge industrial open net cages that spew out fish sewage and excess nutrients that end up smothering our reefs to death, end up ruining very beautiful, pristine waterways like the D'Entrecasteaux Channel, the Huon River, over right beside Port Arthur, the famous Port Arthur waterways there. These salmon are industrially raised, and the outflow of their sewage is damaging our local coastal waterways. Now, Joe Palmer, the minister, says that we're a vocal minority. UCOM, which is a polling organisation and a reputable one, has recently completed a poll which shows that 75% of Tasmanians, 75%, three-quarters, want the salmon feedlots out of our shallow waters, which is basically where they all exist. In fact, the local newspaper, the Mercury, the main newspaper in Hobart, at the beginning of this year, ran a poll in which they discovered that more than 50% of their readers refused to either buy or to eat salmon. Now, that's changed in the 2 years since the book Toxic came out. And I do urge you or anyone to read Toxic, because in the 2 years since it came out, the industry and the government has never been able to find one mistake in that. The reason that it's bad for you is that there are more trans fats in a serving of 180 grams of salmon than there are in a Big Mac and chips. When you go to the supermarket, 1/3 of the salmon that you buy will be antibiotic resistant, and that's from national measurements done that were reported by ABC 730 on TV. They use artificial colouring to make the salmon pink rather than grey, and they use preservatives which are banned in Europe because they're considered to be carcinogenic. So what I'm saying to you is that eating salmon is not only killing Tasmania, but it may well damage your health as well.
Peter George is with us from the Tasmanian Alliance for Marine Protection. As you can hear, without a glowing report card on the Tasmanian government's new plan for the Tasmanian salmon industry. You might remember last year a lot of hoo-ha about the problems with the Tasmanian salmon industry, leading a lot of Australians to cut down on their consumption of Tasmanian salmon. Now the Tasmanian government has unveiled a big plan to rehabilitate the industry. It's not passing muster with environmentalists like Peter George, who joins us now as we approach 1:25. Joe gave us a call. Joe, are you still there?
Yeah, I am.
So people are texting in just about Caniston, just to close the loop on that. It's an antifungal. It's not an antibiotic. It protects against things like nappy rash and athlete's foot and stuff like that.
I understand that, but the fact is, though, that it's a similar action. So whether it's an antifungal or whether it's an antibiotic, it's killing bugs that are detrimental to humans.
Yeah, but I think the reason why people are concerned about the overuse of antibiotics in agriculture is that it helps to breed antibiotic-resistant bacteria that can then infect us, and so you start getting staph infections and all kinds of stuff that you can't.
That's fair enough, Josh.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to know,
hang on, Peter. I'll just let Joe finish.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I'd like to know, though, is that where are the independent scientific studies that are being put forward here? Because it seems to me to be doing polling to people who don't have a scientific understanding or information in front of them, you're asking people for an idea. What do you think? And I don't know.
Yeah.
So
I take your point. That's the criticism of the.
How can polls be put forward? How can polls be put forward as being evidence of reasons not to do A, B, C, or D?
I take your point, Joe. Thanks for the call. Good to talk to you. I'll let you go now. Peter George from the Tasmanian Alliance for Marine Protection. You just wanted to respond to that?
I was just going to say that the antibiotics are put into the fish feed. The fish feed and the fish feed that is excess goes into the ordinary waterways and gets consumed by wild fish. And let me say to you this, that Tasmanians may have an opinion. The reason that Tasmanians have an opinion is that in the last couple or 3 years, it's become perfectly clear that these multinationals that take their profits overseas are not looking after our waterways. They're damaging our waterways. It's not a matter of sort of necessarily just wanting scientific proof. It's actually the proof of our own eyes. It's the way that our reefs are disappearing. It's the algae and the slime that's getting washed up on our beaches. Tasmanians are not dumb. They know when the wool has been pulled over their eyes. And frankly, after 2.5 years of so-called public consultations, what the government has come out with is not a plan, as Fiona's really made the point. It's a plan to have a plan. And no one in Tasmania is going to accept this PR spin. The truth of the matter is that the companies have got their way with this, and it's going to be at the cost and at the death of our beautiful waterways down here. We're not environmentalists. I'm not an environmentalist. I'm just a resident who lives down and beside the water and sees what's happening. If these companies were actually concerned about our waterways and listened to what we had to say and changed their practices, we could support an industry like this. But it's industrial practices of industrial salmon farming that we stand up against. It's not against fish farming per se. It's about the damage that it's doing to our state.
Peter, great to talk to you. Thanks for your explanation.
Thanks for your time, Josh.
Have a good one. That's Peter George from the Tasmanian Alliance for Marine Protection. Peter has given us a call from Bayview. Hello, Peter.
Hi, Josh. Hey, look, I've just come back from Faroe Islands, and which is Scandinavian island, very remote. And between the two islands, there's a narrow channel, and the Arctic water just flows straight through one way. Now, they have enormous fish farms there, and flush out by the pristine waters of the North Pole, the salmon there is destined for the fish markets of Japan and New York and Paris and London, etc., etc. It's so expensive, it's so valuable and the reputation so high that the locals can't afford to buy their own fish. And I was at the equivalent of one of their IGAs, and I was stumped and I was stunned to see fish for sale in the freezer, pre-packed from Vietnam.
Oh, unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, we have a similar. It's not that dissimilar here in terms of the stuff that we export to other countries versus the stuff we keep for ourselves. Peter, thanks for the call. Lovely to talk to you. Thanks for all of your texts as well. I've got to say, we have scores and scores and scores of texts from people saying, I will not eat Tasmanian salmon ever again. It's 1:30.